Hey, and welcome back. You know, on this channel, every now and then I talk about things that have to do with audio and hearing and maybe sometimes how the brain processes audio. And I thought we'd take a quick break today from the usual piano lessons I give here and talk a little bit about an audio-related phenomenon which is pretty interesting and is called ASMR. In case you haven't encountered it, you can just go and do a search here on YouTube. Just type in ASMR and see what you get. But to those of you who don't want to go out and do this, I'll just say that this has been a genre that has been gaining popularity here on YouTube over the past few years. And behind it is the basic notion that some sounds like tapping or scratching or, the sound of the scissors next to your ear when you're getting a haircut, and often just the human voice when it speaks softly creates a sort of tingling sensation in several individuals. This was dubbed ASMR, which stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. And I thought I'd talk a bit about the science behind it, just because I personally have an interest in sound, in audio, and also have more than a passing relation to brain imaging. Now, I'll give you a quick spoiler before we get started. I was going to talk about the science behind ASMR, and when I did my research on it, I discovered that there really isn't that much science. And the reason is fairly obvious. To study something scientifically, you have to be able to quantify it in some way or to measure it. And really, there is no good way of measuring ASMR in people. I mean, usually the studies that have been done, which are, you can count them basically on one hand, involve having people self-report the phenomenon of ASMR. So, people who rate their own subjective experience, which, is a perfectly valid way of sharing information between people, but is a really poor way of doing science. For example, if you're doing a clinical, say, trial for a drug, you wouldn't just ask people how they feel after getting the drug itself, even if you had, say, a control group getting a placebo. Instead, you'd usually have some sort of marker that tells you how the disease is progressing, how the patient is doing, or maybe some sort of objective measurement, like has this subject been hospitalized, or has there been a worsening in his or her symptoms as assessed by a physician. But for ASMR, there really isn't such a thing. So naturally, its study by the scientific community is currently very lacking. Nevertheless, today I'm going to cover some of the very recent papers that have come out dealing with ASMR. And I'll also try and sort of share with you some of the, I think, existing speculations as to what are the origins of the ASMR phenomenon. I mean, what is it that causes some people to feel these tingly sensations in response to certain sounds? So we'll talk about things such as synesthesia and frisson and misophonia and so on. So the first study I'd like to talk about actually looked at the connection or the characteristics of people experiencing ASMR in terms of what's called their Big Five traits. This was a paper published or written by Beverly Fredborg from the Department of Psychology at the University of Winnipeg in Canada. And the Big Five traits are sort of at least one way in which psychologists assess the personality of particular individuals. So basically, this is a questionnaire that's given to an individual where, it has multiple questions. And at the end, it produces these 5 scores on 5 different categories that are openness to experience, which basically, how willing the individual is to just experience new things. Conscientiousness, which has to do with how basically self-disciplined and, say, dutiful is an individual. Extroversion, that is, how inclined is a person to interact with other people. agreeableness, which measures kind of how agreeable a person is. So how likely are he or she to sort of go along with other people. This sounds a bit negative, but in reality it also usually implies that the person is sort of kind and tries to get along, so it has positive and negative sides. All of these personality traits have positive and negative sides, regardless of which side of them you're on. And the last, fifth personality trait is neuroticism, which is the tendency to experience negative emotions. Now, this study looked at a cohort of 290 people who experience ASMR with a matched control group. And again, because there's a problem in assessing and quantifying and even defining ASMR, what sort of questions do you ask a person? If you experience tingles from one thing, like scratches, but not from another, do you have ASMR? Do you have a different kind of ASMR compared to a person who experienced the opposite? Maybe getting triggered by someone's voice. But, putting these questions aside, they let people self-assess themselves using a questionnaire, and they looked at the correlation, basically, between the big 5 personality traits and this group of people experiencing ASMR. And they had some interesting findings. Basically, they found that people who experience ASMR, I think maybe not surprisingly, had higher scores on several things and lower scores on other things. For example, their openness to experience was higher on average, which is not surprising considering that they were open to the ASMR experience itself. They scored lower on the conscientiousness scale, but the researchers themselves point out that, there's no hard evidence that people who experience ASMR are less conscientious than the regular people who don't. So they were a bit skeptical about this particular result. They were slightly less extroverted, which might explain probably being introverted. They were more open to some sort of experiences that originate from within themselves, like say ASMR, which requires sitting down and focusing on in sort of an inner experience almost. They had pretty much the same score when it comes to agreeableness, and they had somewhat higher neuroticism scores. So what this means is, again, that they have this tendency to experience negative emotions more easily. Now, when they looked at their population, they noticed that it had a higher risk. I mean, the number of people in the ASMR population that suffered from moderate to severe levels of depression was actually higher, significantly higher, compared to the normal population, the matched controls, which of course leads to a higher scale or higher score in the neuroticism scale. So it's kind of interesting to note that people experiencing ASMR are also displaying higher levels of depression overall. The next study I'll talk about was published by a guy called Stephen Smith from the same university, actually, from University of Winnipeg in Canada, from the same department of psychology, but from a different group. And what they did here is they tried to use a brain imaging technique, which is called resting state Fmri, to examine the brains of people with self-reported ASMR. Now, in a resting state Fmri experiment, what you do is you lie in an MRI scanner, basically not doing anything. And what the scanner does while you're lying there is it sort of looks at the activity, the basal activity of your brain. So basically, there are, the different parts of your brain work. It looks like, when you look at each of them independently, it looks like kind of noise. But then when you start looking at how they correlate with each other, how their activity at one point correlates to the brain's activity at another point, you start seeing correlations. I mean, it turns out that the different parts of your brain they are correlated to each other. And by seeking or by trying to quantify which parts of the brain are correlated to which other parts of the brain, you can start seeing networks emerge. And this is what a resting state fMRI scan gives you. So it gives you, basically it partitions the brain into all sorts of different subnetworks. For example, you could have one network that has to do with the motor function in your body. There is one particular interesting network, which is called the default mode network, which appears in all of these resting state fMRI scans. Now, there is a lot of debate on what exactly this particular network means. It consists of several different regions that seem to talk to each other, like the medial prefrontal cortex, the medial temporal gyri, the cingulate or posterior cingulate gyrus, and other parts which I'm not mentioning here. But the interpretation of what this particular network means, exactly what it does in the brain, is kind of not well understood. However, a lot of people who do study the default mode network seem to think or hypothesize that it reflects kind of sort of internal reflection, internal thoughts, or internal activity as opposed to a reaction to any sort of external stimulus. So it's kind of like a meditative part of ourselves. So what this study did is it looked at 11 people having, self-reported ASMR with matched controls, and it noted that individuals with ASMR actually displayed significantly less functional connectivity in their default mode network. They also saw some reduced connectivity between the frontal lobes and the sensory and attentional regions in some parts of the brain that basically they took to sort of mean reduced inhibition, basically indicating that people with ASMR have a reduced ability to inhibit sensory, emotional experiences. So they kind of get lost in their internal meanderings while listening to these, say, ASMR videos. Now, these are the only two major publications I've encountered dealing with ASMR. Maybe there's one or two more, but that's pretty much it. It's a very desolate intellectual space, again, for the aforementioned reason of it being difficult to quantify ASMR. So now we come to another interesting topic, which is really trying to find an explanation for ASMR. So what is it actually that causes this phenomenon? Again, this is something that really people still don't have a good explanation for. But there are some hypotheses and interesting tidbits that are worth mentioning. Now, the main point is that ASMR involves basically sort of a fusion between physical sensation, the tingles, and a sensory input, which is, could be the sound of a voice or tapping or scratching or whatever. And it's kind of interesting to look at the field of psychiatry and psychology and ask ourselves which other phenomenon are we aware of that involve a similar thing, that tie a sensory input, specifically sound, to some sort of physical sensation. So one such phenomenon is called misophonia. Now, in misophonia, what happens is that there's a trigger, some sort of sound, that causes an aggressive behavior in patients. For example, it could be maybe breathing that causes a patient to scream or yell or attack the source of the sound just to make it stop. This is kind of observed quite a bit in people that have PTSD. So, soldiers coming back from a battlefield with post-traumatic stress disorder sometimes develop a very strong aversion to certain types of sound. And it's very interesting when you think about the phenomenon of trauma. Trauma has a very powerful way of altering the brain. It's sort of, the traumatic moment can really rewire our brain in a very significant way in a very short amount of time, specifically if it's associated with a loud sound when it happens. Basically, or anytime you have a trauma, the brain instinctively associates the source of the trauma, or what it thinks it was the source of the trauma, with very negative emotions. So, if you were a soldier in the battlefield and a grenade detonated close to you, and that caused post-traumatic stress disorder, in this particular case, the strong explosion sound would now cause you to be extremely averse to loud sounds. Now, ASMR is not really misophonia, but it does make you question, are they related in some way? Obviously, there's no trauma that is related in some way to ASMR, so, that's not the source, but misophonia itself doesn't have to come as a result of trauma. That was just one of the cases in which people report suffering from misophonia. Another interesting related phenomenon is frisson. So this word describes a pleasurable tingling sensation that occurs during an emotional response to music. Now, this is not ASMR because, basically what frisson describes is chills. When you hear that really good piece of music and the chorus starts or the climax hits and you get this chill. And I'm sure, every one of you has this particular piece of music that they remember listening to and saying, wow, this is so good, I'm getting chills now. And when you think about it, this is similar, but not exactly what ASMR is, right? You are getting a physical response, but it's not a direct physical response to the music or to the audio source. It's an emotional response to the audio source, and the emotional response triggers the physical tingling sensation, the chills. And this is not what happens in ASMR. In ASMR, what we think happens is that the audio source itself directly triggers the tingling. There's no emotional component to it. Still, it's an interesting sort of cousin phenomenon to consider when thinking about ASMR. The last related phenomenon I'd like to mention in the context of ASMR is that of synesthesia. And synesthesia basically refers to the mixing of senses. So some people, for example, unrelated to ASMR, report, seeing sounds or smelling colors or, mixing or perceiving one source of sensory input as another. Now, there are many different types of synesthesia, probably most of them not related to ASMR. For example, probably the most common one is one where people associate particular shapes with colors. And, there's an interesting exam that you can give to people. You can have like a large piece of paper and you can put 5, the numeral 5 on the paper, just fill it up with 5s all over the place. And between the 5s, you sprinkle a few 2s. So, a 2 looks like a mirror image of a 5. And if you were just, if you were a normal quote unquote human being and you were to look at this page, you'd have a really hard time identifying the 2s in this sea of 5s. But what happens is that people that have synesthesia will immediately the 2s will jump out at them. They'll just like within seconds spot all of the 2s. And the reason they'll spot all of the 2s is they'll tell you, well, of course I see the 2s. They have a different color. So they actually their brain perceives these 2s. It sees them and perceives them to have a different color, which is really kind of cool when you think about it. And this affects about 1.5% of the general populations. So one of the hypotheses about ASMR is that it is a form of synesthesia, one that mixes sensation with sound. Whether this is true or not is unclear at this point. There really isn't enough information to make a judgment, especially because, again, it's very difficult to quantify this subjective feeling of ASMR. So whatever the actual explanation for ASMR is, it would have to wait for some sort of objective marker which will allow researchers to somehow measure or quantify this thing in, well, as little as a subjective manner that is possible. So I'm going to wrap things up at this point. I've discussed some of the scientific studies about ASMR, and hopefully I've given you some stuff to think about. As I've said in the beginning, in my spoiler, there are no clear-cut answers as to the real scientific basis of the sensation of ASMR. I think judging based just on the size of the population that reports feeling ASMR, there's obviously something there. But it will probably have to await someone, some clever scientist who would have to come up with a way of actually measuring this thing. That's it for now. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time, where we'll probably be back with our piano lessons.